Okay, so we're going to go for an interesting scene, or part of an interesting scene today. And it's going to be very, very strange, but the whole point of this scene is that it provides a bit of comic relief in the tragedy. So Shakespeare normally does this at a point where the tension gets pretty high. He then throws in a bit of comedy, and that's really interesting because it sort of lightens the mood. Remember, they were going to the theatre for entertainment, so you don't want to make it too dramatic. You want to give them a bit of flair for their money. So we're going to meet the porter. Now, this is a man who, this is a servant, and he'll be standing at the door of Macbeth's castle when he starts to hear knocking, because people want to get in. Now, Macduff wants to get in and other people want to get in, because obviously this is where the king is. You know, it's now a really important place to be. But the porter starts to imagine what it would be like to be the porter of the gate of hell, and what kind of characters he would see. Now, I find this really interesting, and I really like this. I really like this scene for a couple of reasons, and I hope I make it clear to you as we go through. However, it is a very, very weird scene, and there are going to be very, very weird points that I'm going to have to make, so I do apologise in advance. But it did come up on the Edexcel exam paper as the text that they were examining on, so bear with me here. Okay, so the porter says, "Here's a knocking indeed. If a man were a porter of Hell Gate, he should have old turning the key. Knock. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there in the name of Beelzebub?" Beelzebub is a name for the devil. "Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Come in time, have napkins enough about you. Here, you'll sweat for it." So on page 30, down the sides, you will notice that there are points here that kind of help you to translate what's going on. Now, he talks about the farmer having the expectation of plenty, and this is where I really like this scene. The farmer thought that he was going to get a lot from his farm, so his crop, his harvest was going to be very good that year. And I find it really interesting that kind of reflects Macbeth in a way. All these people coming to the gate of hell have acted in a very similar way to Macbeth. So Macbeth has the expectation of plenty. Macbeth believes that he will get a lot when he becomes king. And I think this kind of foreshadows the ending, because this man had the expectation of plenty, but he's ended up in hell. Now, Macbeth has the expectation of plenty, has the expectation of being king and being a successful king, and then he ends up being killed and presumably ends up going to hell because he's committed the sin of regicide. By the way, I'm going fast on this, so please make sure you pause this as you're making notes, and make sure you make these annotations in your book. But it's really interesting that the first person through Hell's Gate is someone who acts like Macbeth. So then he imagines it again. Knock, knock. Who's there in the other devil's name? Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. So to equivocate is basically to lie, but not necessarily to lie outright, not to be like, no, I didn't do that, but to kind of mislead people into believing a lie. So rather than saying, no, I absolutely didn't do that, just sort of saying, no, well, I would never ever mean to hurt someone. You're not saying that you didn't do it. You're saying that perhaps you did it, but you didn't mean for it to end up in the way it ended up. So you kind of like mislead people into believing your lie. And it's really interesting here, because if you look at the side, it actually talks about the Jesuit Father Garnet, who tried to save his life by sort of, again, being an equivocator, or he was convicted as guilty of equivocation, meaning that they thought he was sort of being really misleading in order to get out of trouble. And he was actually he was actually in trouble and for the gunpowder plot, which was when Guy Fawkes aimed to blow up Parliament with King James inside. And it's really interesting here because the equivocator committed treason, and by being part of a plot to kill the king. And what has Macbeth done? Well, Macbeth's committed treason by committing regicide. So again, there's another person coming through Hell's Gate that's very, very similar to Macbeth. And the last one, knock, 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 who's there? Faith, here's an English tailor, come hither for stealing out of a French hose. Come in, tailor, here you may roast your goose. So if you look at the side, English fashions often imitated the French, and the tailor might have been over economical with his fabrics, so meaning he didn't use as much fabric as he should have. And he's saying, you could come in and heat up your iron because hell is so hot. So it's quite an interesting, play on words there. But also it's really interesting that he sort of talks about how this man has not been generous enough, basically. So he's tricking people out of their money for something that's not of good quality. But mainly it's that he's cheating people out of things and he's not being very generous. That's really interesting when it comes to Macbeth, because obviously we know Duncan was a really generous king. And again, it kind of has a lot of meaning later on, because you will notice that Macbeth is not a very generous king, and actually he takes away more than he gives. So he kills Macduff's family at one point as well. So again, he's taking quite a lot from people that are his subjects, people he's meant to take care of. So if you look at those three people who come through Hell's Gate, they're all very similar to Macbeth, and I like that that bit of foreshadowing that we see from the porter here. I think that's quite funny at a stage when the play is very, very tense. So he does actually open the door. So knock, knock, never at quiet. What are you? But this place is too cold for hell. I'll devil porter it no further. I had thought to have let in some of all professions that go to the primrose way to the everlasting bonfire. So he calls it like an easy and attractive way. So to go to hell is easy and attractive. It's more attractive to do bad things than it is to do good, and that's quite interesting again, because it kind of reflects Macbeth. And it, for him, it seemed he was very, very easily tempted, and I think that kind of goes with that goes with God and free will as well, because sometimes it's easier to do something bad than it is to do something good. So it's easy to be tempted in that way. So he says, anon, anon, I pray you remember the porter, and he opens the door and enter Macduff and Lennox. Was it so late, friend, ere you went to bed, that you do lie so late? So basically, why didn't you wake up and answer the door to us? Took you ages. Faith, sir, we were carousing till the second cock. And drink, sir, is a great provoker of three things. So he's basically saying he was drinking all the way to the morning. What three things does drink especially provoke? Porter, marry, sir, nose painting, sleep, and urine. Lechery, sir, it provokes and unprovokes. It provokes the desire, but it takes away the performance. Therefore, much drink may be said to be an equivocator with lechery. It makes him and it mars him. It sets him on and it takes him off. It persuades him and disheartens him, makes him stand to and not stand to. In conclusion, equivocates him in a sleep, and giving him the lie leaves him. So basically, he's sort of saying that when you drink too much, you end up being full of sexual desire. As a man, this is what he's saying. You end up being full of sexual desire, but not actually able to perform because you've drunk so much, so you can't do that. This is where I'm telling you it gets a bit weird, so I do apologise, bear with me here. So he says, as a man, it's almost like he's saying here that alcohol ruins your masculinity. So alcohol ruins your ability to perform sexually as a man. And what's really interesting here is when he talks about that, he then says basically you wake up and you know you may want to sleep with someone, but actually you end up just really needing to wee. And that's what he's saying here. You really want to urinate. Now, the reason that this is a really important thing, even though it seems like a really weird and really random part in the play, and this may be a very uncomfortable, weird video for you, but basically the point here is actually that he's saying that alcohol makes men almost less masculine. And he's talking about how it really has toyed with his masculinity to drink because he wouldn't be able to perform sexually. Now, what's really interesting, and this is where it becomes a really good point to analyse if it did come up in an exam. So if it came up in an exam like it did in Edexcel, this is where it becomes really interesting to talk about. Not only have we had 3 people who kind of foreshadow what's going to happen to Macbeth, we've had the porter confirm that actually Lady Macbeth is very masculine, because if you remember when she got the servants drunk, she actually says, that which hath made them, that which hath made them drunk hath made me bold. There we go, the exact quote. That which hath made them drunk hath made me bold. That which hath quenched them hath given me fire. So Lady Macbeth talks about how she's become more passionate and stronger and braver because she's been drinking. And the porter is talking about how he's become weaker and less masculine through drinking. So again, it really highlights how Lady Macbeth is a very masculine character. And it proves that actually she's perhaps a lot sort of more in control than we first thought she was. Like, she seems in control, but now it's really driving home that she's more masculine than a lot of the men in the play. And then we're going to leave it there, and we're going to talk more about the other part in the next video, where there will be a special guest star doing your video for you. So make sure you have a look at that video. As I said, it's a very weird scene, but it did come up on Edexcel, so it's really important that we go over it and definitely make all the annotations, and make sure you go back and pause the video and make the right annotations.